I remember the first 1,000 riders. I think I knew the names and probably personally knew the first 200. It was just so organically grown and organically driven. And then the other part of it was getting drivers. And ultimately that is what set, I think, Uber apart, is just total driver hours and long-term having more driver availability and marketplace liquidity. That ended up being the area which really was the hardest part for Lyft, especially early days, was getting enough drivers on the platform who wanted to drive, especially those peak hours, Friday, Saturday night.
Welcome to the Early Podcast, where I interview the builders behind the world's most iconic companies. I'm Max Crowley. I was Uber's 25th employee and spent years scaling one of this generation's wildest rides. Each week, I sit down with the early innovators who really made it all happen. So please, tune in, like the show, subscribe, tell your friends, keep coming back. Let's go. Nick Greenfield, good to see you, man. Thanks for joining the pod.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I have a million questions for you, obviously.
I wouldn't be surprised. There was always this Chinese wall between Uber and Lyft.
Yeah, so we have to specify, you are number 4 at Lyft.
Yes, I was number 4 at Lyft working on it. We had about 12 people at Zimride, which was the precursor, but I was the 4th person and really the first non-engineer, non-technical person working on Lyft.
I don't know if there's been another conversation like this between early Uber and early Lyft that's public.
Is this a détente? Are we allowed to talk to each other?
I was thinking about calling it like the peace offering between Uber and Lyft.
Travis might go back and fire you for having a conversation with me.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I have to tell you suck at some point in this interview, or I'm going to be like tarnished from the Uber alumni group.
We learned how to take it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I love that you're wearing pink to represent Lyft. So
gotta rep it. Not as much pink now with Lyft as there once was, but early days, we were big sporting the pink.
Yes. All right. We're going to get to it. So you're from Maryland. How did you end up at Stanford?
I applied. Somehow, out of sheer luck, I got in. It was an amazing 4 years in college. And the timing when I was there, just for getting into the startup world, was, I think, probably the best period. We were just going through the financial crisis. And it felt like as a school, it was going from a school where people were doing banking and consulting after school to like the whole world going to startups. Stanford obviously has been known for producing folks going to startups forever, but just the entire MO of the school was shifting into this tech world where we are now. So my friends started Snapchat, early employees at Uber, early employees at Lyft, early employees at Airbnb, some of the early folks at Palantir. Played Ultimate Frisbee in college, and my coach was, I think, the 50th engineer at Facebook. So just being in that environment early days, I think, was an amazing experience and really sheer luck, again, to put me on the path that I've been on so far.
Yeah, I mean, timing is everything. Well, how did it feel in San Francisco 2010, 2011 as you graduate and all these companies are coming to market and consumerized? I mean, the iPhone is 07, 08, the beginning of this being a platform that creates all these companies.
Yeah, I graduated college, turned my flip phone in, which I went through all of college with, for a BlackBerry.
Okay.
So just to give you an idea of the timing.
Yeah. The BlackBerry Storm, RIP.
Yep. Yeah, BBM. It was a thing for a brief moment. My aunt gave me her BlackBerry. And I went from the BlackBerry to the iPhone. I think it was maybe the 2nd or 3rd generation iPhone after moving to San Francisco. And I think they were just adding location services. Maps was just becoming important. Obviously, it had a camera and it had music, but the iPhone really did transform everything over the period of, call it, 2010 to probably 2015, as the world looked very different. So going to San Francisco with the BlackBerry, San Francisco is a very different place. All the early tech companies that were really getting going were small. There was no DoorDash. There was no Uber Eats. There was Airbnb, which I was an Airbnb host at the time. So I would rent out my room when I left. I was underground. All of these things in San Francisco were very different. And I feel really fortunate that I got to experience San Francisco in that era just before it became the hub for the Facebook and the Apple and the Google shuttles that were taking everybody down to the peninsula and the South Bay every morning and evening. It became a different place. My original rent in my apartment in North Beach, I lived with 3 other guys. I was paying $1,100 a month. I don't think you could do that anymore.
No, there's no one in San Francisco paying $1,100 a month for rent.
Yeah, definitely.
Unless they're living in like a tent or something.
Yeah, definitely a different time. And you took Muni, right? You biked everywhere or you took Muni. And that's how the world operated in San Francisco. And if you were very lucky, maybe on a Saturday night and it wasn't raining, you could flag down a cab.
So you joined Zimride, which is the precursor to Lyft, which people might not know. There was a company before Lyft called Zimride. What was the problem you were solving with Zimride, and why did you end up joining the company?
John and Logan, who were the founders, were super mission oriented. Their goal, and John used to show this presentation all the time. He would show the evolution of transportation. He would show how canals made everything more efficient by moving with boat. And then you would move on to the trains and how the train system made things more efficient. And then how cars helped you eliminate the horse and buggy, right? And then eventually it became this highway culture where 80% of cars were being driven with one passenger or less, right? It was basically just drivers in cars.
Yeah, wildly inefficient.
Wildly inefficient. And so the motto of Zimride is life is better when you share the ride. And from a marketplace perspective, Zimride believed that the way you could improve transportation is through building true ride sharing for long distance rides. So if you look at a marketplace, you think about where is the liquidity. The hypothesis was the liquidity would be in the rides from San Francisco to LA, from New York to DC, where the Craigslist ride share market existed, right? That was what would work. And it was working in Europe. It was happening with carpooling.com in Germany. It was working with BlaBlaCar, which was out of France. There was lots of ride sharing happening there. And Logan, who was the CEO and founder, really believed deeply that there would be a better product experience. And by building social connectivity, trust and safety, validation that rides existed, that passengers were real, the drivers were real, by having a rating system, you could build enough trust in the ecosystem to have this long distance ride sharing marketplace. So I got hired originally to go to Zimride to actually do sales, which was selling the Zimride SaaS platform to colleges and to corporations to have their own network of built-in trusted ride sharing, because we believe that you could start with a small network and then grow it to a consumer-facing business.
Yeah, you start more contained, you trust people a bit more, potentially almost like carpooling a bit, and then expand from there. I mean, it's really wild. The genius of the origin of Zimride really are a precursor to a lot of what ends up happening, because this company started in 2007. This is before this seemed normal to be riding with strangers.
Yeah, deeply mission oriented. We had a mural that was painted on the wall in our office at 568 Brannan that was the guy who did the Facebook murals. You know, the story of the guy who
made $200 million.
Exactly. Something crazy like that. Maybe if he held, he's probably made a lot more than that
right.
Even now, right? So we had him come in and actually painted the walls, and John and Logan wanted the walls painted blue. They wanted to make carpooling and ride sharing social, right? The idea was, how do you build these social connections that create trust and fabric in the society? And that is so core to what ended up becoming of the company. Eventually, we moved into a consumer-facing platform. So I was 6 weeks in. There was no one else to work on it. There was this small YC company called RideJoy that had just launched, and they were doing consumer routes, and they were starting to get some marketplace liquidity with rides between San Francisco and Burning Man, of all places. And just like every good business at the time, whether it was Airbnb or TaskRabbit or us, we were leveraging Craigslist to get all of our drivers and to find passengers, and building all these Craigslist bots to get it to work. And so I took on the role of being the consumer guy in 2011 because we didn't have anyone else. And that's really where I started to learn about kind of starting to build out some of this marketplace.
Yeah. So again, it's long haul transportation. I've actually used BlaBla in Spain. It was great. I mean, I got a ride between two cities. It was a deaf driver, probably hard for them to find people to ride with them. There was other people in the car. I mean, it works really well in Europe, but it's not something that really worked in the US. So what's the pivot point? When do you kind of first know that model's not working in the US?
For me, it was pretty clear about a year into working on the consumer side that we couldn't get enough supply to match the demand, and we couldn't figure out how to generate either of those in a sustainable way. And we looked at the way Airbnb was moving. If you remember Airbnb early days, you had to request stay with somebody, and then they had to accept you. And Airbnb came out with instant approvals and instant bookings because they saw that time in between, you would just lose somebody. So we went out and we tried to build our own supply. I built a bus company that was operating on Zimride. We hired charter buses. between Berkeley and UCLA. I would dress up in frog and beaver suits and go into the dorms. We'd sneak in. You couldn't really go in, but I would sneak in and put flyers under people's doors and try to talk to students. Oh, do you live in LA? You got to take our bus, right? And we put professional bus companies on as well. So trips between Vegas and LA and DC and New York. And we partnered to put all of this marketplace supply on. And still, the demand wasn't there. There weren't enough people who were buying seats, even on buses. We looked at trains. We talked to dozens of different Trailways companies, which is these old bus lines, to figure out, okay, how do we build this? And it's just not what the consumer ended up wanting to do. And so I think John and Logan at the time, even though we were pushing hard on Zimride and continuing to push hard on Zimride, they saw this new company that came onto the scene, which was not Uber. This company was Sidecar. And Sidecar is really the driver of this early days peer-to-peer ride sharing in San Francisco.
It's unbelievable, the Lyft Uber comparison, because again, it's hard for me not to, just being honest with you, going on the record, still have like a disdain for Lyft. You were our competition. There was angst there. But I also have this deep respect of not many companies could pivot in this way or launch a bus company or do these things. I mean, there is still a DNA piece that we both made it happen, but just in very different ways. It's just a wild that people could go about this in two different ways and still make a lot of things happen.
Yeah, well, Uber at the time, we didn't understand Uber. Before the pivot from Zimride to Lyft, we had one shared mutual investor, Troy Carter, who was Lady Gaga's investor. Yes. And I remember Troy coming to the office and John was sitting down with him. And afterwards, John would, debrief with us because John was 26. I was 22. We're the same age. We're doing burpees out on the back as the sun's coming up, like getting ready for work. Everyone's very friendly. And Troy said, have you ever been a black guy in New York trying to get a cab? And that was an interesting moment for John to be like, oh, okay, this Uber thing has a place. It's this upscale black car, expensive, anybody, and you can get a ride and it doesn't matter. And it's going to be a logistics company, right? That was the thinking of what Uber was. And for us, we looked at Sidecar, and Sidecar figured out that short distance rides had marketplace liquidity, especially in San Francisco, where it would cost $30 or $40 if you could get a cab in San Francisco. And I think a few of your other guests have talked about this, about just how hard it was in SF to get a ride, right? You couldn't do it. So if you could figure out how to get marketplace liquidity and all of a sudden it costs $12 instead of $30 and you can press a button and get a ride. I mean, we used to have a gypsy cab guy that we would call to pick us up in San Francisco because it was so hard. Right. And then he started doing Sidecar. And we're like, all right, this is a thing. And you could get from North Beach to the Mission for $12. Like, yeah, sign me up. This is amazing. I'll do anything, right? That's how it works. So we saw that happening. So we had a hackathon in early 2012, I believe. And as we were going through the different ideas, there were two big ideas. The first idea, which is the one I voted for, thank goodness for that one, was a Google Maps-like service where you could notify somebody that you were on the way to them and it would track you in Maps so that they would know, oh, Nick is on his way and he's arriving. If he ever goes out of the way, hey, there's a safety issue here, right? A new feature enabled by the iPhone. And the other was, hey, let's build a competitor to what Sidecar is doing. Female drivers, female passengers, all about trust and safety.
No men.
No men. No male drivers, no male passengers. Let's build Uber. Let's build Sidecar, but for women. Female drivers, female passengers. And it's funny because about a year and a half ago, David Risher, who's the current CEO of Lyft, relaunched that idea of Women Plus Connect, which was the original idea for Lyft. So why is Lyft pink? Well, Lyft was pink because until probably 4 weeks before the launch, we thought this was going to be female drivers only, female passengers only.
And then what happens?
We couldn't get drivers. So originally, as we were building this out, we were getting all of our drivers from what we called our Zimride Elite group, which was very similar to Yelp Elite. These were our drivers who were driving every single week between LA and San Francisco.
And they're doing that to make money.
To make money, but also because they were driving. A lot of people make that drive.
Okay.
So they were opening seats in their car. They were selling them for $25 to $50 each. We met them. We cultured and built this community. This is what I did at Zimride.
But they're likely not doing it just to make money. They're likely doing the ride already.
They were doing the ride already. So our Zimride Elite community is where we were getting drivers from. And it was mostly men. And we had a few women. And I think when we went out to get drivers, we tried to get women drivers. I think we could get like 3. It didn't make sense. And when Sidecar announced in early May, which was the fatal flaw of Sidecar, that they were going to open Memorial Day weekend, Sebastian, who was our first mobile engineer, built the Lyft app, the original version of the Lyft app, in about 3 weeks. So he just said, I'm building this, we're getting this out, and we're getting it live. So we had to go get drivers. So we compromised. We went to our Zimride Elite. We said, hey, we'll pay you guys 25 or 30 bucks an hour to drive on this platform. We're going to put these pink mustaches on the front of your car, and let's see what happens. But we're going to have this app live. And so Memorial Day weekend, I think Friday of Memorial Day weekend of 2012 is when we launched Lyft. The rest is history, but the rest is a lot of story to cover.
It's so crazy. So at Uber, we had launched Taxi in Chicago in March, April, let's say. Travis had this vision. He knew this was eventually going to go to everyday drivers driving their own car. I mean, I was in a hot tub with him months before that in Costa Rica, and we were like talking about it. And there's videos of him in summer 2011 talking about it. So he knew this is where this was going, but we had gotten burned so much by regulatory that he was just cautious about continuing to go this way because, again, we were regulated everywhere we were operating. It was black car or a taxi.
TLC.
Licensed chauffeurs.
Yes.
And then you guys just go full on with Sidecar. Hey, it's everyday drivers. You're still doing background checks. You're checking the car, whatever else. But it's this everybody driving other people.
Yes. And that was why we did some of the things we did early days at Lyft. So some folks probably remember this, but most do not. Lyft early days took no take from the driver, was donations only.
So you could choose how much you were going to pay.
You could choose how much you were going to pay. It had a suggested price, but you could choose how much you would pay. You could toggle that number up and down. It was drivers were scheduled. So we had a whole scheduling algorithm that we built out, and you could reserve the times that you wanted to drive. And we guaranteed a floor for all drivers for some period of time, which again, 2012, they've since rectified that. That is no longer a thing.
Yes.
But building all of that original marketplace out, we wanted to do things very differently. We wanted to be your friend with the car. That was what stood out. Uber was this upscale black car service for fancy people who work at hedge funds who can pay more than they can for a cab. That's how we thought about it. And Uber X was still a TLC or whatever
Correct.
The California equivalent was. It was regulated. And so what we did was we said, look, we're not going to make any money. We're going to build marketplace liquidity. We're going to put these cars on the road, and these drivers are going to make whatever they make. They're 25. If more comes in through the donations, they'll make more. The idea was you're going to sit in the front and you're going to fist bump your driver, and it's truly going to be community driven.
It was crazy. I mean, I'll never forget when that launched, and the pink mustache and the riding in front and the fist bumping. And it was so antithetical to what we were doing at Uber. And it was just like, holy shit, what is going on? I mean, it's just crazy. Where does the pink mustache come from? Because it was genius. It was brilliant. I hated it. Everyone at Uber hated it, but I also respected it because every car had a pink mustache on the front. It was brilliant.
Lyft would not have been possible without the pink mustache. And the pink mustache also, in the long run, ended up holding Lyft back. And where it came from originally was at Zimride. We worked with Ethan, who was the founder of the Car Stache, which was the name of the pink mustache. And we would take those mustaches and we would offer them as a raffle item at these big transportation management authority conferences at Zimride. And one day, and I don't remember the exact story, but I believe that John was like, let's put the car stashes on the front of the cars and we'll do a mustache parade when we launch. And in San Francisco, it's such a small city. I mean, it's 7 by 7, but really it's like 4 by 4 in terms of the concentration of where everybody's working. So you couldn't not see these pink mustaches. It's very similar to today, where I live now in Miami. You just see these Waymos going by all the time with the, with the LiDAR spinning over the top. It was iconical. People would ask, what is that pink mustache? And it worked incredibly well to generate the demand and the thinking behind what is this other service? What is going on? And you'd ask people, and people were either you were in the know or you weren't in the know. And eventually everybody knew what those pink mustaches were all about.
So you launch. What are the first couple of weeks like after this goes live?
The first few weeks and months were crazy because I remember sitting in my kitchen probably 3 months after we launched and doing the math. I was like, okay, if we grow 25% every week for the next 52 weeks, this is going to be a really big business. It was crazy. We had Zimride, we had Lyft. Lyft was this tiny little experiment. So when I say I was the fourth person working on Lyft, it's because we had 25 or 30 people who were working on Zimride. Everyone was working on both. And within those first few weeks, John and Logan recognized that Lyft was working. They, I think, acknowledged that Zimride was a big uphill climb. And they shifted the entire company overnight. Everyone, you are going from working on Zimride to working on Lyft. And they left 4 or 5 people to kind of hold down the fort on Zimride. And all of a sudden, we were all Lyft employees. We all got Lyft.com email addresses, or Lyft.me email addresses early on. We all had Lyft shirts, and we were all thinking about the pink. And we were all focused on getting our friends and family to use Lyft. I remember the first 1,000 riders. I think I knew the names and probably personally knew the first 200. I mean, it was just so organically grown and organically driven. And then the other part of it was getting drivers. And ultimately that is what set, I think, Uber apart, is just total driver hours and long-term having more driver availability and marketplace liquidity. And we'll get to that, I'm sure. That ended up being the area which really was the hardest part for Lyft, especially early days, was getting enough drivers on the platform who wanted to drive, especially those peak hours, Friday, Saturday night.
Retention of drivers, acquisition of drivers. I mean, what do you think Lyft struggled with in those first few months on the driver side?
It was hard to find drivers. And where could you find drivers? San Francisco was a unique market in that you could use Craigslist to get a ton of people who were looking for gig work. And we were able to leverage that to a point. But then we had to bring the drivers in, screen their cars, train the drivers, get them to show up to these in-person trainings, which we ran, making sure that they passed their background checks, which there was no checker at the time.
Yep.
The background checks they're pretty involved. It took a long time. So getting folks on the road and then scheduled and into our system was a multi-week process to go from, hey, we've got demand growing exponentially and supply growing linearly. And that became the problem for Lyft. And I think for Uber for years and years and years was, how do you both match the supply and demand from a time standpoint and just get enough marketplace supply? So we were subsidizing. We had power hours for drivers where we would subsidize them even more. We would run these big scheduling algorithms where we had everybody scheduled out. And so Chris Scholey, who was our first data scientist, I think maybe the only person from the early days still at Lyft that I know. And he built these algorithms where he would use these old, really high-powered IBM's operations research machines to figure out exactly what every driver's hours would be based on their requests. So all of those different things were happening. And looking forward, about 6 months after we launched, you started to see that drivers would churn. And this idea of driver churn became, again, the bane of Lyft as we went, where we would see that we would onboard 100 drivers, but maybe only 10, 15, 20 would actually stick around. And of those, only a small percentage wanted to do these most important, valuable hours. And ultimately, Uber implemented surge pricing and Lyft did not for a very long time. And that enabled drivers to make a lot more money early days on it.
Was there another unlock that you got to with Lyft on the driver supply side that created more liquidity, that created more drivers, or was it all wages that ultimately were going to drive?
I think it was effort, and it was city by city dependent. As we moved from San Francisco and I went down to launch LA as our second market, different markets had different employment challenges. And so those employment challenges many times favored the Lyfts and the Ubers of the world because it was easier to get drivers. We learned how to post more on Craigslist. We learned how to leverage ads on Facebook to drive new driver acquisition. We learned how to leverage referral programs. There were lots of different things that ultimately came together to drive the growth of the driver platform and ecosystem that would get built. Again, I left Lyft relatively early on. It was always the challenge. That was on the top of funnel. And then there was the mid funnel and bottom of funnel, which is, how do you build a system that takes you from 2 weeks to 24 to 48 hours of driver onboarding? How do you make the submission of your driver's license and your insurance easy to do before you come in for your in-person appointment? How do you move all the in-person appointments to virtual? So each different part of that funnel has spent, for both these companies, billions of dollars probably in optimization and loss and time and opportunity to figure out, okay, how do you create the easiest possible funnel without creating risk around the driver profile?
I mean, something you guys did early on as well was utilizing drivers to bring on other drivers. Obviously referrals as well, but then also even in onboarding, you found people locally that you actually trusted to be able to like onboard drivers and bring them on. The community aspect of Lyft, I think, was helpful in drivers and riders in the early days in the local market.
Early employees, if you look at the early employee base of a Lyft, for example, was predominantly folks who we met through the community. If you look at these local markets, you look at a Chicago, for example, the woman who was responsible for doing driver onboarding was one of the first driver interviews. And we did leverage the community side of it. And ultimately, Lyft built a lot of tools to let the community, for example, take photos of cars and do car inspections. Car inspections were a huge burden in a market like in New York. Where do you park? If you have an office in Midtown, people can't bring their cars around. You have to inspect the cars, a multi 7-point in these cars. But it was easy if you could go to Queens and there was somebody who was in Queens who was already an approved driver that could do it. So building up that peer-to-peer side, again, the history of life is better when you share the ride, your friend with a car, continuing to build those mechanisms out over years happened. The first couple years, it was brute force.
Travis definitely understood in years prior, because really when he started, Uber knew that supply was the game. From the beginning, it was how do you get supply? How do you maintain it? I mean, we ran an ad in San Francisco that was shave the stash. And it wasn't to get consumers to switch over from Lyft to Uber. It was to get drivers to change over from Lyft to Uber. It was always in the ethos of Uber to build. We didn't build destination in the app because we knew that that would improve the experience and that might increase people's usage of Uber. And we needed tools on the driver's side to get more and to keep them on. So everything was supply-based.
Lyft early days missed that. So we believed that the quality of the experience, and remember, John came from Cornell, the hospitality school. John understood hospitality and experience better than anyone. And early days, there was this belief fundamentally that a better app and a better design and a better experience would win long-term. And what did Travis know? 3-minute pickup times and low-cost rides would win the day. So if you look at a market like LA, early days, Uber was going out to Glendale and getting disgruntled taxi drivers who would drive 70 plus hours a week. We were getting these beautiful actresses and models who would drive on Tuesdays, Wednesdays from 11 to 2. And so when you open the app on Saturday night, the first 12 months in LA, as demand started growing, we were doing really well for the first couple months. But then as that demand started to rip, you open the app, well, there's a driver on Uber 5 minutes away in Santa Monica. And then there's a driver 22 minutes away on Lyft in West Hollywood, which is really more like 35 minutes. I'm going to go with Uber. And that's where Uber started to win in all of these markets, is on the supply side. And Lyft was playing catch up for a long time. We had very high standards on the cars. We had very high standards on the drivers, especially the first 50 to 100 drivers in every market. We wanted to be representations of the brand. These were brand ambassadors for this Lyft experience and this Lyft brand. And again, Uber recognized that's not what the consumer wants. The consumer wants fast pickups, cheap rides, clean cars.
And to get somewhere.
Let's get them there. And that is where Uber started really building a lead. 2014, 2015, 2016 is really nailing that supply side liquidity early on. Uber had done a couple things to call it grease the wheels, if you will, on that. Giving out iPhones to drivers in LA. I remember seeing these giant photos of giant piles, boxes and boxes and boxes of iPhones. And our regulatory was we don't know if we can do that. That might make them employees. There were things like that we were very hesitant around doing. Uber would request Lyft rides and then offer drivers referral bonuses.
No, we never did that.
Never did it. We were so offended by that. You can't do that, right? Which, in our head, that's illegal. But reality, no, that's competitive dynamics. So again, as Uber began to pull away, at least in the US for a long period of time, although it took 5, 6, 7 years and Lyft figured out ways to kind of claw back a lot of market share, Uber was willing to do a lot of the things to push the boundary. You said before that Travis was cautious. I think it's the first time anyone has ever said Travis was cautious, because it felt like Uber was willing to do almost anything to win in every single market.
But if we go back to that, when did you first know that Uber was going to compete? Because again, you guys launched Memorial Day 2012. It's almost a year until Uber launches real ride sharing. We did the UberX piece, but it was all licensed. We were trying to get limo drivers to get into a black Camry instead of a black town car. We were trying to do the regulated thing. And then at some point, Travis puts out a memorandum or whatever. He puts out this call to action that basically every regulator, if you don't regulate Lyft, we're coming. And then we come. When did you know Uber was going to be competing in this?
January 2013, we launch LA. I think Uber launches the day before in UberX peer-to-peer format.
Okay.
And
so it was beginning of 13.
I think that Uber in 12 in San Francisco was starting to really get going with just an app and maybe a couple other markets on the peer-to-peer side. But when we launched in LA, it felt like Uber had like the scope on us, was really focused on us. We weren't focused on Uber. We were focused on Sidecar. So Uber didn't really become the true competition until probably later 2013. But I think Uber recognized early on that Sidecar probably like not going to make it. Lyft is the real competition. You know, Founders Fund had backed us. Andreessen was coming in. Sidecar had grown too quickly and didn't have the operational chops in the same way that Uber or Lyft did to really kind of get everything going. And I remember talking to Andy Pimentel in probably fall 2012. And we were friendly, but it was kind of like we can't really be friends anymore.
Our relationship is over.
Yeah, exactly. And Bennett, I think, had either recently left or was maybe he was still there. But it was these like friends who were, you know, we all went to college together, right?
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
And it definitely,
and great people, like
exactly, like totally different. Like, okay, we're competing with each other now. Like, we can't be seen getting coffee. That can't be a thing.
So, why do you think Sidecar didn't work? What do you think happened there?
I think that they were competing in a very challenging market. They tried to grow too quickly. They expanded to too many markets. The app experience was okay. They couldn't get enough drivers. So without an Uber and without a Lyft, Sidecar probably would have worked their way there over 2-3 years, but they didn't have the same level of just operational execution and rigor. I think that that's what's so amazing. I mean, Lyft and Uber and Sidecar had such amazing product market fit. And these were businesses that you go from a $30 ride to a $12 ride, from North Beach to the Mission or Marina to Soma. Everyone wants to go from these places. All of a sudden you go, oh, it's a $9 billion taxi market. Well, like you look out today, it's like tens and tens of billions of dollars in revenue or in gross bookings between, you know, Uber and Lyft in the States, and continuing to grow double-digit percentage every year. There was such pent-up demand for these products. And Uber and Lyft just had the operational capabilities and focus to go execute and do it well. Lyft, to its credit, has always stayed focused and narrow. We're just doing San Francisco, then we're just doing LA, then we're just doing Seattle. And Uber had great operators that were on the edge, great folks in Chicago, in Boston, in New York, in San Francisco, then internationally. Toronto, I think about as one of those early really strong markets for Uber kind of getting going internationally. These markets where Uber had a playbook and said, we're going to go execute and move as fast as we can. And our cost of capital at Uber just keeps going down and down and down. And we can pour capital because Travis saw how amazing this marketplace demand was and the elasticity of demand. If you keep bringing that prices down, like you're going to double, triple, quadruple the size of these markets. And so they were just go with really strong operators. And I think that Sidecar just didn't have that level of excellence, if you will. It took a while for Lyft to build it. And part of that was because of our ethos. And part of the culture of Lyft was we really wanted to deliver an incredible, your friend with a car, fist bump, sit in the front, car stash experience.
But it does say a lot about Lyft that even with all of that, it was able to succeed. You know, that it still fought back. It built the operational rigor. I mean, something still was in the ethos of Lyft that had that operational rigor. Otherwise, it would have also just fallen off.
Lyft didn't expand internationally. Really, I mean, today is in Canada and it just made an acquisition in Europe, but more or less has been North America for 12 years. And part of that is Lyft's focus on doing really well in the markets that Lyft is in and launching each of those markets being more capital constrained in an intentional way. I mean, Lyft is 30-40% market share in many markets, over 50% in the US in some local jurisdictions, and is probably in the US somewhere between 25 and 30%, or maybe 35% today of all ride sharing volume that's happening in North America. So Lyft is still definitely a powerhouse company, $6 billion in revenue, $1 billion in free cash flow, trades at a third of the multiple Uber, which is interesting in its own right in today where it exists. But yeah, it's one of the defining consumer companies. I still, to the point of like competing with Uber, I still, when I get to the airport, I go look on everybody's phone, what app are they using to get a ride? Like I will walk up and down while I'm waiting for 5 minutes and count how many people are using Uber.
I still do.
And how many are using Lyft. I ask every driver that I'm in the car with, which do you use? Where do you get more rides? What makes more money? I mean, I still have all of that DNA. And I think that Lyft still has the competitive dynamic. And John and Logan were phenomenal founders. I think today the business is in a very different position with a professional CEO who's done a really nice job of realigning that business to be longer term successful, and autonomy for both Uber and Lyft will be the future here. But if you think about defining consumer brands of the last 10, 15 years, ChatGPT, I mean, very few things grew faster than Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, Snapchat, Instagram, right? Like these are the brands. It's got to be in the top 10 of fastest growing consumer brands that we've seen in the last 10, 15 years.
What was one of your first moments? You talk about you're in your apartment, you see the numbers growing. I mean, when was one of your first like, all right, this is going to work? This is really starting to take off. And maybe it's multiple cities. I mean, when did you like, all right, we got something here?
I'm in LA. It's probably March 2013. We launched about 6 weeks before. And my co-launcher with me, David Rust, we're out at the different sororities, walking around. I think it was on Mondays at USC. You can go and tell them about what you're doing. And we walk around with these cake pops, with these pink Lyft cake pops. And we do it at USC and we do it at UCLA. Fast forward the following Saturday night. We're up, it's 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, as you do, watching what we called, I think you guys called it God View. We called it Balloon View. Because Lyft was originally, the logo was this amazing hot air balloon lifting a car, which I think they should bring back.
We'll insert here. This is the image here now. Someone's put it in.
Yeah, the graphic.
Yeah.
So we were sitting there watching Balloon View, and we just watch, because we can see the photos of all the passengers. You had to connect your Facebook account. Lyft, you couldn't sign up for Lyft unless you linked your Facebook.
You guys banned me on Facebook, and I was banned on Lyft for years, and it was like I kept having to create fake Facebook profiles, and I don't know if I can admit to that now, but I guess I
think you're good. Statute of limitations is run, max on Lyft.
So many. No, I'm back. A couple of years ago, I magically just reset, and I do occasionally use it.
Yeah, when the price on Uber is $100 and Lyft is $30, you're using Lyft. I get it.
Yes.
I do the same thing every once in a while.
So you're in LA.
So I'm in LA, and we've just done this kind of like cake pop run earlier in the week. So it's Saturday night. We're watching. Everyone connects their Facebook, so you can see the profile photo of every passenger, and we're watching what's happening. 2 o'clock in the morning, and we see that all of these girls who we'd gone to their sorority are using Lyft. And we're seeing all the bars that they're going to. They're going to Shore Bar in LA, or they're going to, I don't remember, in Brentwood, or they're going to somewhere in West Hollywood or Hollywood. And we see this map of LA and these orange and green buttons, going. Orange was someone's requested a ride, and green is the ride has been accepted and the driver's driving there. And, we're seeing at one time, I think we had synchronously like 50 rides going or something at one time. And I was like, yeah, like this is working. This is going to be a real thing. And it contrasts to when we launched Lyft, we did this mustache parade through Santa Monica, and we had all these cars, 25 cars, the mustaches driving through Santa Monica. And it took 4 hours before we had our first ride request. And I remember headquarters calling and being like, Nick, like, what is happening? Why do we have no rides in LA? Like, what have you guys been doing for the last 4 weeks getting this thing off the ground? Then, fast forward 6 weeks, and we had just all of this volume happening on Balloon View. And we would stay up, when you launched a market, and, I know you've had some launchers who've been on this podcast before who talk about that experience. You get to see your work and the result of your work happening almost in real time. You do a street team exercise, you onboard the drivers, you go out and have a launch party, and then you sit there and you just watch these things happening. You watch this community build, because fundamentally, Lyft, Uber, Airbnb are these social experiences where I request a Lyft, I bring 3 friends with me, they all download the app. And that social in-person physical social experience is why these things grew so quickly.
It's an echo chamber, and it just grows, and it's viral, and the product market fits there, and the experience is always a cut above whatever you were doing prior, and it's just game over.
I mean, the bar was taxis in LA and San Francisco. I mean, just the first 2 markets. That's a very low bar, and the experience was so much better. I remember seeing a couple other moments in the history of Lyft, which also made me think about this. There was some analyst at Bain who aggregated all of the coupon codes that we'd ever created for Lyft, because you used to be able to stack coupon codes. So you could have like $500 in free credit before we figured out how to lock that down. Because it was donation based, we're all like, what, like we were burning so much money, and the investors were just like, keep going, keep going. So we would see this, and I got sent this deck from a friend of mine who worked at Bain. He's like, oh yeah, this is going around, like the $500 of Lyft coupon codes. It's like, okay, it is going viral. Like it is truly going from one market to the next. People are sharing these codes. And you used to watch the map in San Francisco, and it was so much cheaper and so much better, where people would be what we called button mashing, where they would be requesting a ride, and you could look in the logs of the engineering logs. You could see that somebody had been requesting a ride for like 15 minutes every 2 to 3 seconds by pressing the request ride button, because they could see the drivers real time moving on the map. And so until a driver would then accept their ride, they would just keep pressing the button. So you get 500 requests from one person, and then they would get in the ride, because the demand was so powerful for Lyft instead of the taxi experience or taking Muni. But again, another experience for me where I was like, okay, this thing's going to work.
Yeah. So at that time, drivers still had to accept the ride.
Drivers had to accept the rides.
And we were different things over time, but that driver had to really accept the Uber ride, which was another piece where we were probably different and led to a different experience as far as people getting rides.
If you can think of a barrier to marketplace liquidity and a challenge that you could insert into our experience to make sure that we had the best possible experience, but also making it the hardest possible for us at Lyft, we figured out how to put that barrier up, right? Like having drivers having to accept the rides, the donations, just everything that we were doing was geared around this better, superior experience, because we felt the need to be different from Uber.
Uber was ruthless with Lyft. What was the craziest tactic that you saw that you were just like, WTF?
Man, I think Uber, like hiring people to take rides to get to every single one of our drivers when we launched a new market, and then paying those drivers like bonuses to switch over. It was the most brutal possible tactic, because it was the most harmful possible thing you could do to market liquidity, is to go steal somebody's supply right after you launched for like, 6 to 8 weeks. And so anytime someone opened the Lyft app, there were no drivers or they were really far away. That worked, right? Like it took a long, long time to recover from that exercise. I think there was internally, when there was a whole situation where we had a Travis, you guys had a Travis, we had a Travis, our Travis and Steve and a couple other folks ended up leaving from Lyft and going to Uber. It was the first time where somebody of any senior stature had left Lyft and gone to Uber. It felt like a true betrayal. I mean, these companies were so at each other's throats and disliked each other so much, but there wasn't much executive or senior level hiring going between the companies. And that was different from like a Google and Facebook early days.
Or really any hiring going back and forth. I mean, I don't really remember much.
We would never hire. Like Uber people were not culture fits for Lyft, right? Totally. Like that was not a thing, right? And I think Lyft people were not a culture fit for Uber. There were a couple of us like who maybe could have been swing players, but like there was a pretty stark line between the companies. And that was a huge betrayal. One, because Travis knew the entire product roadmap and knew everything in and out. I mean, he had been really instrumental positively and negatively in building Lyft. I think really positively from an operations standpoint, and perhaps more negatively on the culture side. He just wasn't a Lyft person in the way that he operated. And he really ran the business probably from 2013 to 2015 or 2016, whenever he left. He was super instrumental in driving a lot of the execution and technical strategy. But then we lost all of that. And it was like, it went over to Uber. And so it took a while for Lyft, I think almost to the IPO, to kind of like re-find its sea legs and be like, hey, our entire proprietary product roadmap, which would be like 3 months of head start. Like you guys would launch something, we'd copy it. We'd launch something, you guys would copy it. But you had a few months of head start to try to pick up a few points in market share. And that was probably one of the more, from an outsider, because I wasn't at the company anymore, but watching that happening and talking to the people, I think we felt very betrayed.
Yeah, I remember Uber Pool was one that stood out, where Lyft Line, we got word that you guys were going to launch Lyft Line, which was like the true sharing of a car. So multiple people in a car. We got word you guys were going to launch it. We had no tech. We had not built anything for it. And we just figured we launched like a waiting list to start. We launched a waiting list before you launched the product, which still kind of, even though we didn't have the product ready, it still kind of took the wind out of your sails.
Absolutely.
A bit. And then we were able to fast follow with the product. And again, it was just this tit for tat aggressiveness that any word of what the other company was doing, you had to try and beat it.
Yeah, and it was in the press. It was on financing announcements. I remember, Travis would basically say to any investor, if you guys invest in Lyft, you can never invest in Uber. And he really did a good job of making Lyft's cost of capital much higher than Uber's. And that, you can look at the corporate level, perhaps the most detrimental item that happened was him really cornering the investor market. And you still see it today. The public markets. Uber is a darling, Lyft is a dog, right? In the public markets, whether Uber should probably be a darling. And I think Lyft should also be in that bucket, but he did such a good job of positioning, we are the superior company. You cannot talk to them. We won't do it. I remember when Brian Tolkien, who is a good friend of mine, I think could have been a swing resource.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
He's a great
guy.
Yeah. So Brian was another friend of mine from college. And I remember Brian was in charge of Uber Pool.
Right.
And Lyft line in LA was like $5 to get from the beach to La Cienega. And then Uber Pool was $5 to get from the beach to La Cienega. And I was like, this is amazing living in LA. I was like, everything's free. Those companies burned, again, probably billions of dollars at the Uber Pool and Lyft line. And now they're just starting to come back out with them.
It's like the most ridiculous, crazy thing. But especially in San Francisco, mass transit was hard to come by. A lot of our employees were using Uber Pool every day to get to the office and swore by it. If you're going from the marina to downtown San Francisco, it was one of the best ways to go.
And $350. It's like it was amazing. It was the same price as Muni. Like, it was what an amazing service. It was the perfect, and why Lyft line was so good for Lyft was it met John and Logan's vision for what they were trying to build. John and Logan were legitimately trying to take cars off the road. They wanted to redefine what transportation looked like. And the idea that Lyft would be adding cars onto the road, that it would be adding to pollution, that it would be adding to all these, they didn't want any of that. They viewed that Lyft line was what Zimride was supposed to be. Lyft line was going to be answer to true peer-to-peer ride sharing. And I think in many ways, the economics were very challenging behind it, but that it was that. And I hope that with autonomous vehicles and the Tesla buses and what ends up coming out, I think VW's got a bus coming out. Like, we're going to end up going back to that world in one way, shape, or form to bring the cost down.
So if there was one thing that you would have changed about Lyft's trajectory from a competitive standpoint, what would you have done differently?
I think we could have moved faster at Lyft and been more aggressive about certain market launches, specifically to own and keep market share in some of these places. So in LA, as an example, I would have increased the number of drivers, increased the driver supply, probably burned more capital, but found more drivers who were willing to drive on Friday and Saturday night. I think that ultimately the 3-minute pickup was just so critical, and Uber, again, cracked that code and just got such market share lead that I would have pushed us more to really focus on whatever we can do to retain drivers and get more drivers and get drivers who are going to drive more driver hours. We would reject drivers because they didn't fit the brand standard that we were looking for early days, which again, I think had pros and cons, but especially for Friday, Saturday night, if you were launching a market in the first 3 to 6 months and you didn't have people on the platform, they were going to go to Uber, and then it would take a lot to get them back.
Yeah, more supply, more supply, more supply.
Yeah.
So you've now worked across multiple industries with gig workers and two-sided marketplaces. What are your kind of learnings about supply specifically? And how do you advise or think about building companies now when it comes to supply and acquiring supply, retaining supply? How do you think about those things?
It's all a funnel. And there's the onboarding funnel at the top, and then there's the retention on the bottom. And each of those needs to have a clear, specific owner inside of an organization who is maniacally focused on making sure that works. And you need to really understand the customer on the other side to what's going to keep them in that funnel. So one is building the easiest possible funnel to get people as far down to onboard to whatever supply side they need to be. And then the second is customer obsession driving retention, which means you're talking to customers. It's not, oh, I think this customer is going to stay on because they are making money. I think this customer is going to stay on because we've given them this perk. It is, why are you still offering this listing on Airbnb? Why are you still driving on this platform? Why are you still delivering groceries or delivering food on this app? What is it that keeps you? What is sticky? And building around those experiences, because it is ultimately on the supply side of the marketplace. The supply side, when they are sticking, will tell you why and what you can do to improve. And deeply engaging with those customer stakeholders is mission critical. And I think Lyft did that starting a little bit later, but did that super well. This idea of community and building around that community, where you had drivers outside the office from Uber protesting. The only reason Lyft still exists is because Lyft really did focus on building that community and really listening to and building around the drivers. And I think still continues to do that well. And you see a business like DoorDash has done that very well, really understanding who their Dashers are and making sure that they are giving them the tools that they need to be successful, and they're able to make as much possible money as they can, or whatever the key metric or the key breakthrough item is for them to stand.
Wanted to talk about Stripe. So another thing, just because of the size of Uber and Lyft and the crazy pace of growth, I mean, companies literally got built around these companies. I mean, you mentioned Checker, which is a background checking app and now a multi-billion-dollar company. I mean, we were using Zoom early on, and again, we had teams all over the place. Obviously, now that's a massive company. I mean, Stripe was one that was really wild because we did not work with Stripe. We used Braintree in the early days. You guys worked with Stripe, which is now a massive company. I mean, what was the early days of Stripe like working with them? What were they doing for you? And what was some of the things that broke?
Stripe was payment processing originally. And the use case for Lyft was we needed to pay drivers and we needed to pay them quickly. So Stripe Connect, which is really the most important foundational original new product that Stripe built, was built for Lyft. We were the alpha partner, and all of the requests that we would make, if you look at kind of that old history, were built for Stripe Connect around our use case at Lyft, which is we need to put money in the bank account. We need to get it out to these drivers. So not only is the money coming in, but the money needs to go out to the bank account. It's going from one way to a multi-party transaction. I remember this time with Stripe where we would put every couple days, and it got more and more and more as the business got bigger and bigger and bigger, we would put cash into a Stripe account so that it could go out to pay all these drivers on Fridays. And there was a time where I think we put the money in, but something went wrong with Stripe, and they took like $500,000 out of a driver's a bank account, which they didn't have $500,000. They overdrafted it, and we're going to use that to then like pay all the other drivers. And it was a total mistake. And one of the Collison brothers came over to the office like, I'm so sorry, we'll fix it. And we had like damage control with this driver for a long time. And it was, it was a huge trust thing. You stole all my money, so we would end up going through kind of these rounds. But a lot of the early days, called the first 2, 3, 4 years of Lyft, we're just working with Stripe to build out all of these different payment features, which have ultimately supported a huge amount of marketplace companies. And yes, Uber was on Braintree, and Braintree could, of course, never work with Lyft. And we felt, Stripe, you can never work with Uber. And I'm sure they all work with each other now, because
totally.
Here we are many years later.
I had heard that one of the reasons that Lyft didn't go international was because Stripe was not international. Is that true, or is that kind of a...
I think Lyft didn't go international for a host of reasons. Logan was really big on focus, and it was like, we've got a lot of fish to fry. Things were getting very expensive. Going international, going to London or going to Paris, or these markets had really different regulatory structures. One of the things that these companies dealt with that is kind of almost forgotten history is one of the largest government relations efforts at a municipal and state by state level every single day. And so the idea of doing that in so many different countries would have been really hard. We could have added a new payment processor. I think had we decided we really want to go international, we would have done it. But Logan was so focused on building the perfect Lyft app and then delivering a perfect Lyft experience with John across the US. And we thought there was plenty of market to go. Let Uber go spend and burn all their money in these international markets, which again, I think probably was the right thing for Uber to do. And in hindsight, there were a lot of markets where maybe you wouldn't have done it, knowing the regulatory structure. But I think Lyft, we always treaded much more cautiously.
Yeah, and it's hard to know. It's easy, obviously, in retrospect to say, hey, these are the markets you would have launched ideally. But obviously, there was a lot that didn't work or were expensive or regulatory issues.
First thing I wanted to do, I wanted to go be the international launcher, right? I launched LA, I launched Seattle, I launched Boston and DC and Atlanta and Phoenix. I got to do all these markets in the US. And I was like, all right, send me to London, ready to go. Like, I want to go to some new market. And ultimately it took a very long time before Lyft opened internationally, which is, I think today, except for the Free Now acquisition, is just in Canada.
Looking back, what are your couple of core learnings from being an early employee at Lyft?
The most important is the pivot. We went from Zimride to Lyft, and that was a huge decision to make. I mean, the company had raised at the time a lot of money, $6 million Series A from Mayfield, but it wasn't working the way we wanted it to be. And we had caught fire with Lyft, and John and Logan were willing to go all in and ultimately sell the Zimride business, move every employee over and say, we are 100% focused on this pivot. And that has been really important for me in my career, is understanding that when you have something that is really working, you need to lean into it and lean into it aggressively, but you need to be intellectually honest about when something isn't working, and whether it's shutting a company down or pivoting or making the right move to adjust and iterate. Usually life, and specifically startups, are not linear.
Tell us more about what you're working on now. And I know you also go through a pivot, ironically enough, recently with the business that you have started and operate. And so there's obviously some corollaries there. I mean, that probably influenced some of that thinking.
I started Candid 8.5 years ago. We built a direct-to-consumer clear aligner business, competing with a couple brands that folks might know, Byte and Smile Direct. 2019, we were the number 2 player in the space. It was very similar to the Lyft story, where Uber was a big business. The Smile Direct Club, they were doing $250 million in revenue when we started. We had our idea of how we'd be the better experience, better clinical outcomes business. We're straightened teeth. That's the business. I'm wearing the product
Show
now.
Away.
Yeah. If you didn't know, that's why you should.
Now you know.
And yeah, so we launched, again, very similar playbook, opened in 40 markets. Business topped out about 100 million in annual revenue in DTC, but ultimately the unit economics of the business were challenged, combined with the clinical model and clinical outcomes were also more difficult for cases that weren't the super, super easy cases. So we pivoted, and I took the business from $100 million to $200K, flipped it B2B about 3.5 years ago. So we went through the first 5 years in DTC, had what would have been a clear path to building a $300 to $500 million revenue business, but it had to be that big to get to profitable. But ultimately, it wasn't going to work the way that I believed it could work. So burned it down, started again, went from about 154 million in SG&A down to just above 30. And we've got the business working, growing over 100% year over year, mid 8-figure run rate. We got it back to the place. And again, I credit John and Logan's bravery for pivoting Zimride into Lyft, to giving me the confidence to say, this is an obvious decision. And it was an obvious decision to me at the time. I think it wasn't to the rest of the folks around the table. But unless you're trying to build something that's short duration, if you want to build something that lasts, that's generational, you got to have product market fit, and you got to make sure the unit economics work. And by making that pivot like we did with Lyft, and then I did with Candid, that's how you get something to truly, truly work. And you've got to then have a long duration, which is B2B businesses take a very long time. It's not like the Lyft Uber days where we're growing 25% a week.
A week. Insane. I mean, dude, you're clearly a hardcore operator, and you love starting from scratch and starting over. I mean, I give you mad credit for what you've built. When you look back, you left Lyft somewhat early. Why did you leave? What was your kind of learning, and how do you sort of advise people now as you think about your decisions at those times?
I was too ambitious. I thought I could be the head of everything at Lyft. I was 24, 25 at the time. And John and Logan wanted to put in professional operators to manage and run the side of the house. I was kind of co-leading the launch side before we brought somebody in to really kind of own that and take over the launch business. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And at the same time, I had a lot of opportunities. I mean, Lyft was growing super quickly. People wanted to work with people who were there and who were important in building the early days of Lyft. So I left, joined a company called Washio in LA, on-demand dry cleaning and laundry. I think that's how we first met when we came to Chicago. And then ultimately made my way to New York to a company called Paribus, which we sold to Capital One, and then on to start Candid. So the journey, I think, for me has been one of watching Lyft as an outsider, but also like a deeply invested and like way beyond the financial side of like really wanting this thing to succeed. And so many of my friends from post-college coming from that Lyft world, an amazing team and community. And the advice that I give to folks now is, if you are early at a company, your role will change a lot. Your role is not today what it will be in a year. And you need to be okay to embrace that change and the growth that you will have over a 5 to 10 year period at a company that is growing incredibly quickly, an OpenAI, a Ramp, a Rippling, right? These businesses today in this generation that are very different. But if you started and you're the first employee or the 7th person and you're working on something and you have all this responsibility, you report to the founders, you're not going to be doing that if the company is super successful, and that's okay. Having the patience to know that you're part of, and I hate the term, but you're on a rocket ship. You got to see it on the rocket ship. You got to just hold on for dear life. I think that is true in many ways. At the same time, advice that was given to me, which I really love, was Paul Thompson, who was one of our very early Zimride employees, said to me, if you ever feel like you stop learning as an early employee somewhere, especially as a young person, you should move on. Because he was at a very successful company for a very long time, spent way too long there, stopped learning, got comfortable, and that really challenged him in his kind of peak of his learning years. And so I think leaving Lyft ultimately was the right decision for me. Even though I look back, it certainly wasn't the right financial decision. It was the right decision to help me continue to grow and continue to learn and make myself uncomfortable, because I didn't know what was next at Lyft, and thinking about what I may have done, I probably would have gotten some really nice learning out of it, but I don't have any regrets in leaving. But I think that there's always something to be said for sticking it out, especially when you're on one of these rocket ship rides. You just hold on, and your role is going to change and you're going to get tons of opportunities, and just do the best work you possibly can.
Dude, that's amazing. Great answer. Great to hear. All right. We're going to close up. I have the lightning round if you're down to partake.
Bring it on.
So I'm going to hit you with 7 questions. Kind of give me what comes to mind relatively quickly.
Okay.
All right. Average lights out time. When do you go to sleep?
10:45.
You could change one thing about your career. What is it?
Starting Candid B2B.
At 8 years old, you swore you'd be?
Professional football player.
Really? Like NFL?
Yeah.
Really? Like what position?
Quarterback.
Did you play like in high school and stuff?
I played until 9th grade.
What do you use more, Uber or Lyft?
Lyft.
For sure.
Absolutely.
No doubt in your mind.
Well, I don't even have a smartphone.
Oh, shit. We didn't even talk about that.
Yeah.
Give me the quick thing on the smartphone thing. That's insane.
All right. So I have 2 young kids. I think phones are the most evil devices that we have, not out of intentional evil, but just because they suck our time. I was spending 4 hours a day on my phone. So I got rid of my smartphone, and I have a light phone, and it's not a very good phone, to be clear. But it means that when I'm with my kids, I'm not on my devices. And I don't want to look back in 10 years and say, man, I wish I had spent my time with my kids, but instead I was on my phone. I don't have the discipline. If I have the phone, like, it's so addictive that it's there. So I ditched the phone. I have an iPad when I travel. It's cell enabled, so I can use Lyft. I can use Google Maps. I can have the connectivity. I have iMessage on my computer. But I'm the only person I know who has moved away from a smartphone, and people talk about it. It is a very hard move to make, but I definitely have no regrets. I'm waiting for the better version of the light phone, not the light phone 3, but like the equivalent that has just a couple more features. Like, I need Lyft and or Uber on the phone, and I don't have it. So it's coming, I believe, next 3 to 5 years.
Do you think that they'll keep developing? Like, you think that company will continue to exist?
They just rolled out a new phone, the light phone 3, which is improvement. It has a camera. Mine doesn't have a camera. I'm on the 2. But I have podcasts. So that's my guilty pleasure now.
You can still listen to the early pod. All right. Favorite book?
Killer Angels.
Killer Angels. What's that?
It's about the Battle of Gettysburg.
Sick. In 5 years, what percentage of Uber or Lyft rides are autonomous?
20.
Mentor who changed your trajectory?
John Zimmer.
Amazing. Dude, this is so good. So good to see you. Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah. Thanks for breaking bread.
Yes. We're back.
We're
Peace
back.
offering. Awesome.
No
Thanks,
blankets.
Man. No mustache.
Yeah.
Awesome. Dude.
Cool.
You're the fucking man.
Yeah. This is great.
So much fun.
Yeah.